Well, first, may I say it's an enormous pleasure to be here. I'm very fond of Italy. The police are coming to collect me already. I'm very fond of Italy, and this is a wonderful city. It is a real city, whereas Venice and Florence and Rome have got too many tourists and are display cities. This is a real city, and it's an enormous pleasure to be here. Now, I apologise for not being able to give a lecture in Italian. I'm sorry about that. If I go too fast, shout at me. Ask me, it causes me no problem. Shout at me. Just say go slower. And if I say something and something that seems important and you don't understand what I'm saying, ask there and then. Don't wait to the end. Because remember, standard point about a lecture. If I say something and you don't understand it, I have failed. If I say something, you don't understand it, and you don't ask me, you have failed. All right? Now, history. I'm deliberately talking in conceptual and theoretical terms to try and encompass people who are working on many different backgrounds. But let's start off with an obvious point. History is what happened in the past. It's how we provide accounts of what happened in the past, and indeed how people in the past provided accounts of what happened in the past. And it is the process of discussing our subject, discussing it both in terms of with each other, in terms of research, and in terms of teaching. And what I want to try and do is take part with you in a discussion about how we do history by looking at the issue of modernisation. Because modernisation is a central analytical both concept and a rhetorical device in history. Remember, most of what we do in history is both analysis and rhetoric. And one of the problems is we often run the two together. Now, we at least are not as bad as politicians who will always put the emphasis on the rhetoric when they talk about history, but there is still a need for a degree of rhetoric when we talk about it, because we use terms, words that are not precise, that do not have an exact measurement. Let me give you a brief example here. When I was a student, I was taken along to the Philosophy Society. They called it the Moral Sciences Club. And it was addressed by the first of the great British female philosophers, a woman called Elizabeth Anscombe, very famous Catholic philosopher who was a professor at Cambridge. And she was sitting there, a very formidable figure. She had a monocle, glasses with just one eye. She was smoking a full-length Havana cigar, and she was wearing the gown of her most famous patron, friend, whatever you want to say, Wittgenstein. And she set us a problem. And the problem was as follows. Now, this was a lecture I heard over 50 years ago, and I can still remember it. She set us a problem. You drive home at the end of a day's work and you put your car outside the garage and the door is shut, and the door remains shut all night. But in the morning, for a reason that is unclear, the molecules of the car have rearranged themselves and are in the garage. Now, her question was, why would a scientist and a historian explain that differently? And her fundamental, she spent an hour on it and, very high level. But fundamentally, what she argued was that in science, for a truth to be found, you have to be able to reproduce it in laboratory conditions. Whereas in history, you cannot reproduce something, so that even if you cannot explain it, it has happened. And at the very least, you have to describe what has happened and then try to explain it, adding one last point, which is a point I would make. All history is an interim report. We cannot have a definitive answer. So let us go to modernisation. The language of modernisation, the modern, modernity, different words are used, adjective, adverb, to modernise, verb, noun, different words are used, but that is all. There we are. Our controller is from above. The government is keeping an eye on what we are saying. Yes, it is being reported to Roma. but the concept of modernisation, of change to the modern, has been a central one of historians, whether they have been writing from a left wing, a right wing, a centrist, an economic, a social, a political perspective. The idea has been that history is a process, that there is a category called the modern, and that societies move at a different rate towards the modern. Indeed, when I was a student in Cambridge, I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, Italy in the 17th century was seen as a society that was, I'm not just saying this is right or not, I'm just telling you what was seen as a society that failed to, quote, modernise. Whereas the Dutch and the British got big tick marks, because they modernised. Which, of course, is an argument that an Italian Risorgimento thinker might argue, but which doesn't actually tell you very much about 17th century Italy. All right? Now, this thesis of modernisation was linked to a clear teleology. Just to explain, the idea of a teleology is a developmental process in which you know where you're going, so it is inevitable that you go there. All right? So the most famous teleology, well, the two most famous teleologies are apocalyptic thought. We know we're going to the apocalypse. And the other most famous one is a secular apocalyptic thought, which is Marxism. We know we're going to the dictatorship of the proletariat. They're both, they're both apocalyptic ideas, although the Marxists wouldn't see that as an apocalypse. But the idea is that there is a clear development, and that you get, as it were, sort of approval if you move in the right direction. And that a key element of history is that each stage should be a preparation for the next stage. Now, in this respect, Marxism was exactly the same, although it's obviously political context was different, exactly the same as the standard forms of British 18th century developmental sociology. So the British thinkers of the period, Adam Smith, the economist, or Edward Gibbon, the historian, William Robertson, the historian, who wrote about the Spanish Empire, of course, all argued that society moved from a primitive stage, and the primitive stage is what we would call a hunter-gatherer society. It moved to a pastoral stage. It moved to settled agriculture. It moved to towns and industries, and the towns and industries was the apex of the historical process. Now, in a way, and this is not to criticise Marx, he takes that and gives it a different kind of reading. But it's this same idea of what is known as a stadial theory of history, that you move through stages. And as you move through stages, you are modernising. And if you don't move through the stages, then you are not modernising. So, for example, Marx argued, I'm not a Marxist, but I think it's important to read Marx because he was a major thinker about historical change, okay? I hope we don't get rung again from Rome on that one. Marx argued that the revolution of the proletariat was possible in Britain, and probable in Germany, but wasn't going to happen in Russia because there wasn't a large industrial developed, working class with a revolutionary consciousness. So in other words, you have to go through the stages, and we're moving towards modernization. And really, I think it's fair to say that for most thinkers, if I'm looking back to my intellectual origins, most thinkers of the time were convinced that modernization was expressed in terms of urban industrial society, societies which had moved away from the kind of social discipline of land ownership and of working on the land, that societies had largely, in whole or part, secularized, at least in their public sort of philosophy and legislative processes, so that religion became a matter of personal faith, not of public policy. And they were convinced that the state was the real development, the modern state being something that had, in a way, in their eyes, developed partly linked to these social changes and partly in order to fight wars. And historians writing about the 20th century in particular argued that the First World War and the Second World War, and then the Cold War, all made inevitable a process of state development that was happening anyway, but all took it a stage further, and added also the key social element that by the 1970s, 80s, people were arguing that social policy was partly there to keep the workers happy and, as it were, disciplined elements of society. So whether you were a Western European social democrat or Christian democrat for that matter, whether you were an Eastern Bloc communist thinker, whether you were an Anglo-American, because remember, whereas now we think of America very much as a free market capitalism, the America of the 1960s had put in the Great Society legislation. They were still living in the aftermath of the New Deal. The New Deal was reversed by Reagan, really, and has then been trashed since, particularly by this current government. But, it was a very different American background for a long while. So there was an idea that international competitiveness, war, and the inevitable and teleological nature of social change had created, from a different set of ideological suppositions, a commonality, similarity of state processes and social organizations. Okay, there were differences, to use the longue durée, there were epiphenomena that were differences in Browdellian terms, but essentially the structure was similar, and this was modernization. And then the key to modernization issues became, how would you spread these models to what used to be called the third world, and which we would now call the global south? So in other words, what was going to happen in China, in India, in Africa, in Latin America? How would they modernize, and how far would their modernization accord with the particular ideological models in the first world and the second world? And that was really important in the second stage of the Cold War, the years of the 1970s and 80s. What were societies like Angola or Mozambique or China after Mao, after the Cultural Revolution? What were they going to do? Okay, right. We all knew where we were going. History was therefore quite easy to teach. It was really quite easy to teach. And you knew who were the key people to teach, because these were the people that appeared to trigger the turns towards modernity. So, Italy big tick mark in the 15th century, big cross mark in the 17th and 18th century. You know, the Dutch, big tick mark in the 17th century, big cross mark in the 18th century. You know, you've got these patterns developing, and it was very clear, and the basic suppositions were very similar, because on the left, it was regarded as important to go through bourgeois nationalism to get to modernity. And on the right, there was interest in the development of what they thought of as effective state forms. You know, so in other words, German unification appeared very important because Germany, after all, created a modern economy. The fact that the Germans lost both world wars didn't seem to have entered into people's thought as to maybe we shouldn't be paying so much attention to them. But you get the picture, right? Now, at once you can see the problem because you're a clever group. What we now see is a very different issue because we are aware that the modern today is not what the modern was in 1970, 1980, 1990. In other words, ideas of modernization face the problem that the modern, the today, the contemporary, the arriving changes all the time. So that if you are going to have a judgment system of tick marks of praise on the basis that you are getting towards the modern, you have to accept that the modern is changing. I mean, what is the modern of today? Not only do we not know what the situation will be tomorrow, we do not know what is really significant about the events of today. And we don't know, and for history, there is no clarity as to what you should put your weight on. So to take the idea of epiphenomena presumes, I mean, as Braudel in the conclusion of the second volume, he describes political and international relations as the epiphenomena. Fine, if that's what he wants to do, we can discuss the rights and wrongs of that. But the key element he proposed was a structural one in which the Mediterranean was fundamentally, the northern Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire to a bit, but he underplayed the Ottomans and he really wasn't particularly interested in what we would call Syria and what we would call Libya, okay? Now, on the global level at the moment, what is the key development? Is the key development to be assessed in terms of numbers of people? About 2/3 of the world's population today is where 2/3 of the world's population was in 1500, okay? In Asia, all parts of Asia apart from North Asia. North Asia, Siberia is largely empty. The rest, roughly a quarter of the world's population lives in South Asia, roughly a quarter of the world's population lives in East Asia, and then Southeast and Southwest Asia has about another 15%. Okay, Europe used to have a bit more, there's no doubt about it, but it never had the numerical weight of Asia. So how exactly are we supposed to assess today, even in terms of the, as it were, area to look at, what is the key element? And history has become much more complicated because we can now look at much more. So go back to the 18th century. I like Edward Gibbon's stuff just because he writes very well. Okay. I know the Italians had a fabulous historian called Vico at the same period, but one has to stick. So Gibbon's book, History, is famous as The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. All right, that's what you probably know it as. In fact, if you read it all, it's actually a history of the world up to the 16th century. But it is the world as known by Gibbon, all right? So there is much of the world left out. And the same was true of world historians writing throughout Western Europe. This is not a criticism or praise of any particular. So now we in theory can cover the entire world when we're looking at world history. You know, we know that we know more about some elements than others. You know, there is not, I mean, I know Italy had a complex relationship with Ethiopia, Abyssinia, but there is much less available because the sources are much more obscure on, let us say, medieval Abyssinia than there is on, shall we say, medieval Denmark, all right? Doesn't mean that Abyssinia is less or more important, it's just there are less sources. But we now know pretty well, we know the world. The world has been digitized by satellites. We understand its physicality. We understand its climate. We are able to do all sorts of archaeological research to look at non-literate societies. None of this answers the question of what is significant and how we should provide a structure of change through time if we are not going to use the term modernity. In other words, what do we do if we don't use the term modernity? So let's go back for a second. If the modern is where we are now, I think it's fair to say that we do not have a united narrative for the world at the moment. You know, all the ideas of triumphalism in the United States in the early 1990s, you know, the end of history, all the rest of it, now appear to just be silly. I mean, talk about epiphenomena. They really do appear to be epiphenomena, the kind of American triumphalism of the early 1990s. But the world today is as much the world of major changes. Take India, for example, at the present moment, not just is it the world's most populous state, it's also it's taking a lot of people out of illiteracy, you know, the enormous changes there for the good. Bad, Hindu majoritarian nationalism is very different to our understanding of what we would regard as the way to operate a political system, you know, in a democracy. And India is a democracy. Okay? And of course, there's also environmental problems there. So you've got, and the question is, if we're going to look at, say, India, if that is the major narrative, it is now the world's most populated country, what elements do we look at? See, India used to be easy, used to be very easy. India was approached in the idea that progress was getting rid of the Brits. Well, we could all agree on that, including the Brits. And it was a kind of sort of vaguely secularist, vaguely social welfarist policies of the Congress Party, which dominated India in the first 4 decades of independence. And India, from that point of view, appeared a kind of slow-moving version of Greece. All right? You know, moving up towards a European modernization, but moving slowly, and that it would get there eventually, which was very much how India used to be seen by outsiders, not by the Indians, but by now you have from the Indian government a sense that they're at the cutting edge, that they represent a successful political model, and that they should not pay attention to Western narratives and Western analyses. And you have outsiders, like all of us, uncertain where to put the emphasis. Same with China. Is China fundamentally a stable society that has worked out a transition to very great wealth, even if the per capita wealth isn't the same as, you know, as our wealth in Europe, but nevertheless very great wealth? Or is that a society facing enormous demographic and environmental problems? We don't know where to put the emphasis. Informed commentators today, the CCP doesn't know where to put the emphasis, you know? So it is very hard. So in other words, the present is uncertain. It's not just that it's changing, the present is uncertain. If the present is uncertain, how do we produce the narrative? Let's now look just at European culture. I'm not implying for a second that our culture is more or less important than others. It's just it's the one which it's easiest for us to talk about. Now, European culture has clearly, and you know, people in this room will have differing views. It's not my job. I'm just sort of saying, but European culture is clearly changing a lot. Issues and approaches that would have been unusual, that existed, but would have been unusual or not so prominent 30 years ago. Blood and soil nationalism, for example, is a classic one. Enormous difficulties about the relationship between economic growth and environmental quality is another one. The question about the relationship between some circles in which religion is to the fore and other circles in which are profoundly secularist. These are very differing accounts. From my particular interest, of course, in international relations and war, how on earth it is going to be possible to maintain stability in a context in which there are divisions between and within societies. All of these, I think, are very unclear. And what they mean is it is now very hard to write a narrative, not just of the present, but also of the recent past. Because is the narrative of the recent past the breaking down of social democracy? And if so, why? And the same thing, incidentally, in Japan, in the United States. Or is the narrative of the recent past one in which accidents play a major role? You know, take American history. You know, it's not ridiculous to say what would have happened if President-elect Trump had been, President candidate Trump had been killed by an assassin's bullet last year is a perfectly reasonable question. You know, it's not a unreasonable question. And I think the arguments as well can be seen in the European context. You could argue, I'm not trying to debate the rights or wrongs of the issue, but you could argue that the Syrian migrant crisis of 2015, 2016 played a larger role in the rise of right-wing political movements in Europe than maybe people and, will say in hindsight, and that it was not inevitable that it would develop the way it did. You know, it was not inevitable that Assad would succeed then, because in fact, in the end, he failed. Okay. And you can then point to what are often extraordinarily small gaps in things like voting attitudes. You take the United States, the Americans call elections landslides. They're landslides generally in terms of the Electoral College, not always. No American election that I know of has the victorious candidate had more than 60% of the popular vote. Okay, we talk of the zeitgeist. You know what I mean by the zeitgeist? The spirit of the age. Well, the spirit of the age is a very complicated concept. And to then turn the spirit of the age into, well, again, take my country, Britain. I'm not saying it's important or unimportant, but obviously from the rest of Europe, I think the most interesting thing of the last 10 years was probably the Brexit referendum. I think I'm right in saying it was 52% to 48%. And that was the voting, that was the voting thing. So it was not the spirit of the age. I mean, that was a result. And in an election, a majority of one is a majority. But it's not the same as saying everybody is part of a zeitgeist. Now, let us try and give a little bit more focus. I suggested to you that the key developments in the 20th century were linked to war. Okay, World War I, World War II, the Cold War. Because what war did, and I think it's fair to say that this is a characteristic of what we call modern society. What war does is create an enormous demand for resources. It is extraordinarily wasteful. Extraordinarily wasteful. If you look at the war at the present moment in Ukraine, the actual rate of depletion of both Ukrainian and Russian munitions is astonishing. Russia is only able to keep going because it's got North Korean artillery shells, Iranian drones. The Ukrainians are only able to keep going because they've got munitions from much of Europe and from the United States. These are extraordinarily wasteful activities and expensive. You go back, look at the navies of early modern Europe, these were the most expensive aspects of the state, the most expensive. And if you think about it, as late as really the development of social welfarism in the late 20th century, as late as that, prior to that, throughout history, war has been the most expensive feature. Now, war does not necessarily mean, and this is where a lot of theorists got it wrong, war does not necessarily mean that you have a modern state. What war means is you have an expensive government. Often, in order to finance war, it actually has to draw on the resources of other groups in society, to borrow against its political support, to borrow in a constituency. Now, in the modern context, modern in inverted commas, okay, it was able to do so by propounding ideologies which led people to give at often very low cost their military labour. Okay? The modern state, remember, what is one characteristic of the modern state? Conscription, reserve systems. You provide your military labour at a very low rate. It would have amazed anybody to think that this should be something that the whole of male society was going to do. Pretty well everybody here who's a man would have been obliged in many societies in the late 19th and 20th century to provide 2 years or even 3 years of your time, you know, without any choice, to be subject to military discipline during that period of time, to live in appalling conditions, and at the end to be a reservist up to the age usually of 40, obliging you usually to provide 6 weeks free for military manoeuvres every year. That was it. It wasn't a social contract. Well, it was a social contract in a way, but it was a social contract which was very much one in which society was conceptualized in military terms. Okay. That's gone. And the idea that the past is any guidance to the present is ridiculous. Yes, conscription has come back in a number of societies. It's back in Lithuania, it's back in Russia. But there is no way, I think, that you could go back to a conscript system of that form in a society like yours or mine or America. You know, President Trump may have all sorts of strange ideas, but I don't believe he has ever suggested that conscription comes back again. You know? And does anybody know which president got rid of conscription, incidentally? Which American president got rid of conscription? Interesting question. Have a think. You won't.
Started the draft?
No, got rid of the draft. This is an interesting one. No, Richard Nixon. Just as it was Richard Nixon that put in prices and wage controls in the early 70s. Often one's images of presidents are very different to what they actually did in political terms. But anyway, modernity for a long time in war meant conscription. It meant the big state. It meant the idea of a very large number of men. It was a male concept of men under arms, and it meant preparation for war. Now, what happened very interestingly is conscription was got rid of in most societies. The Americans were one of the Brits actually had already got rid of it, but the Americans started it under Nixon in the early 70s. By the end of the 90s, it had gone in most societies. Actually, a society like Italy, as with one of the reasons Italy and France kept going with conscription for longer than many societies. Anybody know? Oh, this is interesting. No. After World War II, in the Italian Republic, the same thing in the French Republic, the support for conscription came overwhelmingly from the left because there was real suspicion of the professionalized military and that the professionalized military might stage coups. And therefore, the idea of the citizen under arms was seen as the way to do it. In other words, and this is an important point, because it links to our sociological model we were talking earlier. In other words, ideology played a key role. Sorry, yes, sir.
Sorry. So, but in a similar way, just like in the Chinese army after the Great Leap Forward, in a similar way.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. The ideology of the people under arms is fundamentally a Republican ideology. And in other words, today, we don't see it in these terms. If you were a new left thinker now, you'd be horrified at the idea of conscription, all right? But until very recently, Republican thought was very much that of the people under arms. And that provided the background for a notion of society, which in other words is not economically determined. I started off talking to you about economic ideas of modernization. What I am now trying to do is bring in a number of ideological viewpoints and to say that instead of all states being the same, actually states are often, societies often very different because of ideological factors. Sorry, yes, sir, sorry.
The term is if you can fight as a citizen, you can vote, and if you can vote, you have to fight for the state in the Republican way of this term of idea.
Yes, absolutely. And Republican states have often kept conscription going for much.
As the revolution.
Yeah, as the revolution in France. Absolutely. Now, what that then leads to, thank you for both, and thank you for talking, do please. What this does then is link to a fundamental ideological position, which is important in the nature of war. You see, many historians are worried about war because they think war is sort of strange people who, would want to spend their time killing each other. In fact, anybody that knows about war knows how risky it is and that it's probably not a brilliant idea, but we'll leave that to one side. The point, let's take this a stage further. Where does the Republic often have its enemy? You mentioned correctly, sir, the French Revolution. Where does the Republic
Out and in.
Out and in, yes,
In.
out and in. This is the point.
As the totalitarian regime.
Yes, out and in. But also, I think it's fair to say, let me give you a little test here. This is an easy test. You won't get into trouble. There are 6 continents that are inhabited. We're not talking about Antarctica. There are. I'm going to ask you to put up your hands. Okay, we will go through each of the 6 continents, and I'm going to ask which of the continents has least been involved in war outside that continent, least involved in international war, okay, since 1935. All right, since 35. So let's start. Australasia, Asia, I don't know, India-Pakistan wars in Southeast Asia, lots of wars in Southwest Asia, Africa, yes, North America, South America. Well, that's it. The correct answer is South America. In South America, the last big war was the Gran Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay between 1932 and 1935. In World War II, just about all of South America declared war on the Axis, but the only state that did anything really was Brazil. Brazil sent troops here, about 25,000 troops to Italy. The Argentinians and the British had a war over the Malvinas, Falkland Islands. But really, South American states do not fight each other. But, as you will know, if you know about South America, South American states are quite militarized. Why are they militarized? Because the military is often the arm of the state, or the state is the arm of the military. Yes, sir. Yeah.
For another example, just example in archaeology, just you told before. For example, my ex-fiancée was from Guayaquil in Ecuador, and she had a lot of hatred toward Peru, toward Peruvian, and the border is regarded.
Yes, well,
Yeah,
but that's you're right, that's international ones. But the interesting thing is that in many Latin American countries, the military is used in order to overawe or suppress political opposition, social opposition, regional opposition, or what is defined as large-scale criminality. And going back to our earlier point, Latin American societies are republics. Many of them, the military is a key element of the Republican ideology, as it also is, say, traditionally in Pakistan or Turkey. And the point is that you cannot understand the military and the role of the military imagination in those societies unless you realize they are not so much there to fight other states, but they are there as a kind of living presence to overawe all opposition. I mean, I've been to Cuba twice, and in Cuba, you have your daily display at the big cemetery of the soldiers, to mark those people who were martyrs for the revolution, etc., etc., etc. Nothing exactly the same would be true of a conservative Latin American state. There's no real difference in that point of view. Argentina and Cuba are quite similar in having had a military tradition. But that military tradition has to be understood as taking a role in the continuing formation of the state to a degree greater than that in modern Europe. Now, I know I saw a couple of soldiers here today with semi-automatics, and obviously you have the idea in Italy, as in other European states, the idea is that the army fundamentally will guarantee social order. But the reality is the armies are too small to do that. They really could not do that if there was a significant challenge. And actually, if you look at European societies, even when armies were bigger, it was often very difficult to suppress popular disaffection. France, 1789, 1830, 1848, for example, very, very difficult for the army to, or even more recently, the Soviet Union in 1991. They tried to get the military to, or Spain in 1981. It's not easy. You, in other words, can have the military as an aspect of state formation, but if there is a fundamental challenge to that from society, the ideology in European societies makes it very difficult to use massive force. Yeah, the kind of massive force used in Beijing in 1989 could not be used that year in Berlin. All right? Or take the British. The British fought you can have your own view on it. It's not my job to politic. but the British fought a counter-insurgency war in Northern Ireland against the Provisional IRA from the 1960s to the 1990s. Now, there were probably at the most 300-400 Provisional IRA people, probably. But, you know, the British couldn't bomb out of existence these places. They couldn't drop an atom bomb on Londonderry or Belfast. So it just went on and on and on until a political solution could be reached. Or take Cairo in 2011, the Arab Spring. During the Arab Spring, President Mubarak, who had been an Air Force general, flew aircraft over Cairo in order to try and intimidate the rioters. Had no difference, no difference. He had quite a big army, but it just didn't work, you know.
It might be easier to overthrow the state than control it with the army.
I think that's a very good point. I think so. That nicely raises us up to another aspect of what we.
But not for long.
Yeah.
But not for long.
But that nicely raises the question of what we mean by modernity.
As in Greece, in recent decades.
Yes, but what do you mean by modernity? You see, in your branch of the military, in the Navy, navies classically have not usually been used to suppress social disorder, because although many capital cities are port cities, and although you can use warships to bombard them, as in St. Petersburg in 1917, or in Lisbon during the, I think it's the 1917, I think.
Here in 1918.
Yes, but the reality is that the Navy tends to be designed for fighting other states, whereas the army has a very different role. And I think that different role of it raises questions about the relationship between the military and state development.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Do you think that the army composition of a superpower today conveys how it, how this particular state behave with other countries in diplomacy, as the United States have the strongest navy of the world, and the navy and the air force used to control much of the globe. As in Naples, we have the sea fleet or the air base of Ariano to control much part of the world. As we saw in 2022, Russia uses heavy mechanized and artillery army to make an intervention, as say, in Ukraine, as it was in Georgia or in Dagestan. Does the army composition explain how a state means to be with others?
Yes, it's also linked to ideology. Naval power ideology classically has been seen as that of more liberal societies.
Like the blue British economy.
Well, for example, Athens as opposed to Sparta, or Venice and Genoa, where obviously liberty was not. They weren't democracies, but they were considerably more liberal societies than most. Or the idea that, the British self-image, I'm not talking about, so the idea was that liberal societies were classically naval societies. There's two problems now. One, China, as the world's second largest naval power, is not a liberal society, and in the past, you could argue, we can discuss this, that Japan, which was the third largest naval power in the 1930s, or Germany, which was the second largest naval power in the early 19-teens, we could discuss whether they were liberal powers or not. I would say Japan wasn't, because democracy had been suppressed. In Imperial Germany, there were there was a Reichstag, you know, but it was not really, you know, the real power was round the Kaiser, round the war leader. So there is this issue, very important issue with navies. How far do we use our historical data set to illuminate the future when in fact a historical data set only works for the past? You know, I mean, this is a problem because we often construct from a historical data set analytical rules with which we then read into the future, but it's not necessarily the case that an authoritarian society couldn't be a good navy. And it's interesting, Hitler's Plan Z. Hitler had a Plan Z. Now, it was unreal. The Third Reich's plans were usually very unrealistic. They didn't have the steel for the plan. They didn't, you know, but nevertheless, his plan was for a very large navy. And the Kriegsmarine, you know, the Weltpolitik of the Kriegsmarine was very ambitious. It included the ability to take over or use from the Spaniards and the Portuguese, the Cape Verde Islands, the Azores, the Canaries, and to be able to project power into the Western Hemisphere. You know, now let's be clear about this. I don't agree with Braudel because I think politics and ideology does play a key role. So if you take Germany and German strategy in, let's say, 1939, 1940, 1941, there is an oceanic strategy, okay? The Navy has an oceanic strategy. And the Navy isn't really interested in war with the Soviet Union, okay? It wants to do down Britain and then move on to the United States, okay? But the key political elements is Hitler, and the key military elements is not Admiral Raeder or later Admiral Dönitz or the Kriegsmarine. It is the OKW and the OKH. It is the generals around Hitler who know that their career is based on planning for war to the east. Now, actually, it's very interesting. I don't know how much you know about Italian policy. Mussolini in 42 and 43 urged Hitler to stop the war on the Eastern Front and to concentrate against Britain and America. Mussolini's attitudes were shared by the Japanese. They were shared by Ribbentrop, you know, the German foreign minister, but they didn't gain any traction around Hitler. Because
more pragmatic and less ideology.
Yes, you're right. But the point is, ideology plays a key role in all elements of state organization, from the very top of policy, epiphenomena, whatever you want to call it, to the actual organization of a village community. The difference, for example, between the role of a clergyman in a village community in Russia 300 years ago and a clergyman in a village community here 300 years ago is considerable. It is an ideological. Yes, sorry.
Actually, during the war, but also after World War II, and the notion of the nomos. So how do you keep power on the ground instead of, let's say, having a large-scale project, which was considered typical of England through maybe.
Yes, it's interesting because the British had lots of hypocrisy. You know what I mean by hypocrisy? As do every country. All right. So the British sang songs about, you know, land of the free, and they were running the slave trade more than anybody else. All right. So when we look at the ideas people have, we're not implying that those ideas are not self-use. The British idea was that a large navy meant that although you had a relatively large amount of crew, you didn't need conscription. So Britain was an unusual military power. It didn't introduce conscription on land until World War I, until 1916. Sorry?
It took people from the from inns and the taverns.
Oh, well, they did the press gang for the Navy, but it was only a small number of people, and they didn't have a conscript system of lists of people like. So they saw their navy as the crucial element to their security. Now, the problem is that the British become like the Athenians in the classical world. The Athenians then go on to be an imperial power in the Aegean, you know, the Delian League and everything, and shall we say compromise the possibility of a navy, of a military that just relies on defence. Interestingly enough, look, I have no, you know, if you look at American policy, very interesting here. In the 1930s, again, no conscription in the United States. The American idea was what was known as hemispheric defense. So isolationism was a political policy. It was an ethnic policy. America had acted limited migration, particularly from Italy in the 1920s. It was a policy of autarky economically, and it was a military policy. The idea being that America would rely on the Navy and on aircraft that were going to, particularly the B-17, that were going to be able to provide what they called hemispheric defense, and therefore they didn't need to worry about the rest of the world. Now, that was a policy which was enunciated for a whole host of reasons. Partly, I think, there's no doubt there was a racism, you know, of a kind of white supremacism within America. Partly there was a sort of nativist know-nothingism, you know, traditional, which you can see in subsequent American politics. But partly also it was political conviction. The Americans of the 1930s were small government ideologues. And small government ideologues wanted a small military. So they wanted a large navy and a large air force and a tiny army. America famously in 1939, its army was smaller than Portugal's. You know, they had a very small army. Interestingly enough, if you look at the present president, who has said many surprising things, and it's by no means clear that he is a systematic thinker. Let's just be. One of the things he's actually said, which I don't think people picked up, I mean, it's, you know, it wouldn't work, but this gives you an idea of his mind. He said that he wanted to try and get America, as it were, settled on all its international issues so he could cut the military expenditure. Why does he want to cut the military expenditure? Because he wants to cut taxes and because he's a low government, you know, ideologue. Now, it's not going to happen, and it's, you know, but it's an interesting example of the role of ideology as affecting the state. You know, if the Republicans win the following presidential election, it may be that they go in the same direction. I don't know. Yes.
Two things. The first one, we can officially open the debate, question time. Second is a question precisely related to these topics. If you think that the tools of the concepts of strategic culture and the way of warfare could be useful to analyze these problems, or if you think they are superficial in some ways because they do not tend to count the tendencies to move and the dynamic processes of ideology and politics, for example. So the famous American way of warfare, and if possibly does exist a Western way of warfare.
Okay, let me answer that. So the question I've been asked, which is a very good question, is how do we fit in the idea of strategic ways of war that are specific to particular cultures, or in the case of Genoa, you know, would it be specific to the Genoese? And are they valuable or not as an intellectual tool? In other words, is there a geopolitical strand to the development of societies? And does this geopolitical strand affect its ideology, its political culture? Well, I think certainly geopolitics does affect ideology. But the point to bear in mind is that geopolitics suggests that there is automatically a necessity to go in a certain direction. Okay? But the reality is that that isn't the case. Take Italy. It was not inevitable in 1914, in 1866, in 1939, 1938, or 1940, what Italy should do. No more than it was for any other society. I'm not saying there's anything distinct here. For Venice, it was not inevitable how much weight it should put on, let us say, expansion in Dalmatia. It's not inevitable as to where there's no natural divide that says Padua should be in the Veneto, but you mustn't move on to, let's say, the Adda Valley. There's no. So the problem is that we as historians often use language which is deterministic when what we should use is language which the French have a phrase, possibilism. Possibilism is a very good phrase, okay? And the point is that if you're looking, let's say you're looking at naval development for a society, like Genoa or Venice, clearly context is a key element. And that context can be seen in social structures, ideological norms, governmental practices, and traditional resource allocation. All of those provide context. But at the same time, you have contingency and conjuncture, and other people have a play in the role. So the Genoese might choose to decide they want to do X, but they are not the only players. At the very least, you have to think about the French and the Spaniards and the Milanese. But on top of that, for heaven's sake, there are Ottoman warships in these waters in 1553, 1554. The wretched Brits turn up later. The Dutch turn up later. There are all sorts of players. So you do not control policy. One of the illusions of much historical writing is to suggest that there is a greater degree of agency on the part of past policymakers than in fact was generally the case. Expedience, operating in an information void, not understanding what your opponents were going to do, not knowing what the harvest is going to be. Or take absolutism. Absolutism means cutting the tax collector's throat whilst you shout, "Long live the king." You can hold in your mind totally contradictory ideas. And we need to understand that if we want to understand how a state operates. We shouldn't just look at the source which says long live the, or take, for example, let us say the professor here is the intendant in, let us say, professor, you are Colbert, okay? You are head of the French Navy and the minister responsible, and you are writing in the 1670s to a great aristocrat, Luca over here, and you are saying that we need from your estates, we need 2,000 louis d'or, 61 men for the Navy, plus, crucially, a lot of iron for cannon. Okay, and you write back and you say, alas, there has been a bad, there's been an infection, and the resources from your estates are down, the cattle are dying, the human beings are suffering some strange wasting disease, and alas, all you can provide are 10 men. So much, 600 louis d'or, and you end, long live the king. Well, that's the nature of government. I mean, classically with naval government, classically, the French, you see, France had a wonderful bureaucracy for the Navy. But what it was like the idea, we've got a light switch there. It was like the idea that the minister presses a light switch here, and in Brest or Toulon, Rochefort, Lorient, suddenly something happens. That's not how government works.
But the idea of modernity and addressing the problem. I feel like there's an issue when talking about war, because whenever we talk about war, we don't usually talk about the social aspect. We do it we don't do it so much. But whenever we talk about war, we talk about the way we do war. For example, we talk about the tools, we talk about the strategies, the tactics that the infantry uses, or the innovation that Napoleon brought. And we say that's modernity, because we know that the First World War happened this way, the Second one happened this way, the tanks, the planes. I see that there's an issue with the idea of incrementing the use of tools. Like when we talk about war, we talk about tools, we talk about the rifles, we talk about the cannons. And how they are utilized. Whenever we talk about states, instead we talk about usually ideology or policy making, which is usually a bunch of things. It could be ideology, it could be economy, it could be international relations, like how my state relates to other states. So whenever we talk, there's this difference, right? Because when we talk about war, it's the issue of tools, and the debate becomes, it's modern because it makes more people die, something like that. This rifle is more advanced because it's not just a musket, it's actually a rifle. Or this machine gun is clearly more.
Can I just say, that is not how a sophisticated worker on war,
yeah.
Because first of all, militaries spend their time doing a lot of things other than just fighting. That's point one. And in terms of the society of the military, issues such as recruitment, hierarchy, living conditions, morale are all key sociological and anthropological elements too. And one of the reasons why the military is interesting is the sources are often best. You know, if you look at a pre-modern state, you look at Genoa, you're going to find the sources available for the naval matters are better than the sources available for many other sources. Same in Britain. It's not that, I mean, in a way, if you want, classically, for example, a lot of the work done on the height of people in the 18th century, and using the question, therefore, being how, there was a Hungarian scholar called Komnos did this, on how far people were affected in terms of by early industrialization, all right? 18th, early 19th century. Of course, the only run of statistics he had on height was looking at military recruits. But military recruits was a good source because of the practicality of conscription. You know, there wasn't always universal conscription. But the point you're making, I agree with you that you need to look at the social dimensions, but I wouldn't say that military historians don't. So let me give you an interesting point. Compare World War I and World War II. Now, you could talk about it in terms of weapons and all sorts of things. Actually, one of the most interesting comparisons is this. In World War II, the militaries do not mutiny. In World War I, they do. Now, why is that? What sociological development leads to that? It's not because of food availability being different. And you see, so in other words, the society, the military is a form of society. It is a complex society, less complex than the church. You know, if you want a really complex society, the church is a really complex one. But the military is a form of society which you need sociological and anthropological ones. I was looking at the museum here on the naval matters, which has a lot of books. We've talked about that. But, you know, it does bring up the rowers. It does bring up the ratio between, you know, free men and criminals and slaves. It does look at the living conditions of them. These were actually very important to the effectiveness. It talks about how you had to, you could go for a maximum of about an hour hard rowing, and then you had to stop. And you need to think about what kind of living conditions and rationale and morale you can do to get these people to do.
Yeah, my issue was just with the definition, right? So I understand that you shouldn't do that because it's you waste your time. Usually, I talk a lot to historians that will lose hours on end of telling you the micro bolts on a tank and different that a 30 millimeters does instead of a 24 millimeters.
They're not historians, they're people interested in history.
Yeah.
That's a different thing entirely.
Yeah, the problem is still that I believe that when we talk about war, I find that there is a difference when talking about Mr. politics or development because of the tools are not the fundamental parts, but there's a work behind them, the industry.
Yes.
So it's like whenever we talk about the development of the tools, that's an interesting conversation. Like
Yes.
why we do actually try to develop a rifle instead of just staying with the musket? Or why do we stay with the musket instead of going with the rifle? That's a question that Napoleon asked himself. And when we ask this question, the answer is always a tool question at that point. It's like the musket is better in this period because of the smokes. Like whenever we fight, there's a lot of smoke. So it doesn't really matter if you have, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 meters of advantages in the rifle, because you don't see that far. It's like whenever we pose a modernization of military, we inherently, for me, do it on a tool basis, on a tool debate, on a debate on tools. That's the difference with, for example, politics that doesn't really have that. I mean, we don't talk about.
Okay, let me just say, I think some people do that, but that's more done at the popular level of military history. I don't think that's done at the academic level.
Okay.
And one last point, and this is worth thinking about for all forms, not just the military, all forms of change. Often societies are profoundly conservative. By that, I don't mean they necessarily vote conservative. What I mean is that they often find it very difficult to conceptualize and implement changes in social practices, organizational changes. So in other words, to adopt a new technology is often counterintuitive because it's often highly disruptive. And I mean, I think you were talking about you're working on the move from sailing ship to steamships. Well, leave aside the very serious technical questions, you know, the problem about the provision of coal and all the rest of it. There is actually psychologically a really difficult thing to persuade people to change the nature of practice. And that is also the most classic way you're going to get a revolution. It's when you've got a society experiencing enormous economic disruption. Sorry, you've got two questions there. You first and then you. Yeah, quickly, yeah.
Okay, very quickly, I want to recall again that my colleague, Councillor, about thinking about the effect on the last century. During the Iran-Iraq war from 1918 until 1988, Saddam Hussein was very clever, sorry for the word for such a person, to remember a very famous battle between the Arabs and the Persians, just like the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah of 17th century, because this is not the war about our nation against another nation, but it's a war for ideology, for Islam against the heresy, the apostasy, just like because Persia was Zoroastrian, and it was a very important symbol.
Well, yes, the causes of war are not simply materialist. ideological factors are really, really important. I agree with you. And also, people use all sorts of ways of trying to create a historical, as it were, justification for what they are doing. I mean, again, both Britain and Italy differently used the idea of ancient Rome, as did Napoleon, to justify imperial ideas. But the interesting thing was, it's which imperial Rome they borrow. There were different imperial Romes to borrow. Yes, sir.
Of war for the nationalization of masses.
Yes.
Because we're talking about modernization, and it's probably very similar notion. As I said before, for my specific case, World War I is considered by many historians the peculiar moment, the key moment for Italian modernization, because the population of, let's say, from far villages in southern Italy or the Veneto, they discovered at a specific point that they are all together son of Italy or somehow. And this is a key aspect, I think, because it wasn't possible to create Italians in through cultural ways, through religion, but at that point, through the war, people discovered that, hey, we are here together, and you're going to have to deal with it as Italians. And this is how some people discovered that they were Italians. Like before, they thought they were from Pisana, from my small town, but there's this click that if I'm risking my life, at this point I know that I'm part of something bigger.
Yes. And you see that because in 1866, there was reluctance in southern Italy to fight. But
you have to go as a church.
Yeah.
And you're Italian.
But by the mid-20th century, you've got a very different process of mobilization. I think you're absolutely right. War provides you with an opportunity to mobilize. It means that opposition, political opposition, becomes treasonous at best, or at least subversive. It enables you to argue that if something goes wrong, it is because of the need for national effort. It enables you also, and this is one of the things that 20th century governments proved very good at, which was using the new technology. I mean, what is the effective technology? The effective technology is not really some rifle against another rifle. Effective technologies are things like the radio, telling people that they are taking part in a struggle, ensuring that the war leader can speak to the entire public. I mean, Roosevelt, like, you know, Mussolini, they were exactly the same in this respect. Roosevelt had his weekly talk to the American public on, you know, he told them to have an atlas ready and to follow the war, and he would talk to them about it. So you're absolutely right. And interestingly enough, I use the American example deliberately, because America was very divided in the 1860s, like Italy, by the experience of fighting other Americans, the Civil War. And the South remains disenchanted, a different political world, the Jim Crow world of really vicious racism in the late 19th century. What reintegrates the South into the rest of America is World War II and the Cold War. And that's very important. So I agree with you entirely. But you see, what we're talking about is not that the military history is more or less important. That doesn't help us. What we're saying is that history as a subject is multivalent. And as multifaceted, if you want to use that term, as a multifaceted subject, you obviously take different parts out from the point of study. We obviously do that. But intellectually, we know that they interact. And we know they interact because at any one moment, the same person, the same cobbler in the street, or the same, you know, aristocrat, the same merchant, the same minister, is dealing with economic, ideological, and political issues. They're all there together. We separate them out, but people in the past didn't separate them out. And that is one of the great faults of the Braudelian approach, because he implies that people, as it were, have this clear hierarchy. I'm not so sure that's true. I'm really not sure that's true. Yes, sir, sorry.
I'm sorry, mine is a long question, but I have a point. I would follow my colleague, and the point is the role of this kind of debate of history to answer the question of today, problems of geopolitics. You made a lot of examples in the course of history, recent history, but when we talk about Navy, if we see what the Great Britain of the 18th century, how use its Navy, its economic way of implement its naval fleet. As an example, the Western Indian Company or the Eastern Indian Company that are private economic companies, but with the help maybe of the Navy of the state. And this is a way to use an asset of the defense or a war asset. After the Second World War, European countries, Italy more than others, doesn't want to see another war. Because it was too destructive. Then in the Cold War, we thought if we go to war between the Western and the Eastern Bloc, there will be the nuclear annihilation.
Yes.
Then peace, forced peace, not to be destructive. But then the Cold War ended, and in the recent year, 2022, war returned in Europe.
Yes.
We do not remember Yugoslavia because it's not so important, but in Ukraine. And then our society, our extreme Western societies, thought that economy and interconnected economy would prevent the escalation of the war. But Russia and Ukraine, since the Crimea crisis and then in Donbass, proved that this is not true. And now we saw Ursula von der Leyen that say, si vis pacem para bellum, and then the new Chancellor of Germany, Merz, said, we will have the strongest army in Europe. The 2% of this bill is 100 billion of euros. And then I would like to invest my money right now because I think I would be rich. But when I was a student, I studied that the European Union was created to prevent in some way, the rearm of Germany. But now the point of views are completely changed. Then, what role we as academics and historians have to answer the very important question that all of what we said might be incorrect because the president said that you are wrong.
Okay, that's fascinating. Can I just make one or two comments? First of all, and I think what you're saying is substantially I would agree with. First of all, when two powers go to war, generally they both think they can win. And inevitably, at least one of them is wrong, and usually both of them are wrong. Okay? So the more one knows about military affairs, usually the more reluctant one is to go to war or to support war. The interesting aspect of 2022 was the failure of deterrence. It was really very, very, very unusual because we've had a number of wars since World War II that were unexpected. But everybody knew that the Russians were preparing militarily. The intelligence material, the stuff from satellites were put on the television. Everybody that could go to Russia went to see President Putin and urged him not to do something. And he, didn't. He chose not to. No, but, the point is that, so as far as the present crisis is concerned, we have a failure of the Russians to conquer Ukraine, a failure of the Ukrainians, I'm not criticizing anybody, but a failure of the Ukrainians to drive them out, more understandable, a failure of the deterrent system, and an inability to conceptualize a new post-war scenario, partly linked to the fact that both sides, and us being the West, have valorized our policies in ideological terms. In other words, the argument being, instead of the argument being, how do we avoid the war continuing or spreading, the argument becomes, we mustn't reward aggression. Well, the problem with that is you can't end up with the kind of complete victory that people imagine. There isn't going to be a complete defeat of Russia. It is a foolish idea. It's not going to happen. So in some respects, they need to negotiate viably with the Russians. The difficulty is, how do we actually have confidence in any eventual settlement? That is a problem. That is a problem. I don't know the answer to that. But you don't, as a military, somebody interested in military affairs, this is actually to do not with war. I mean, this is to do, war ending is actually a matter of negotiation, diplomacy, because most wars do not end with complete victories. That is the fallacy. It's the World War II fallacy. World War II, Soviet troops in Berlin and in Vienna, completely unusual. And the difficulty is that now, when you have ideology to the fore, which you do in many contexts, then it makes it much harder for people to sell compromise. Much harder to sell compromise. And compromise, look, compromisers never have any friends. Everybody always attacks them, you can see that in the domestic politics of just about every country we are looking at. Sorry, you go.
Yes, a short question related to this point. What do you think about the thesis of Strachan about the loss of the Western countries, about the possibility to manage limited wars and putting in their efforts just in total wars and thinking every kind of war as the wars of the global wars of terror as total wars?
Okay, the question is, because you see they can't hear you because you're speaking forward. The question is, has the West lost its way in thinking of war? Has it lost its strategy? Partly because it thinks in total war terms, not in limited war terms, not in other words. And to a degree, yes, but what we've got to be careful of is we are not the major players anymore. The major players are China, India, Russia, Iran, several other Middle Eastern countries, the United States. We are not the major players. And I think we have to be very cautious in that context of thinking that our norms or our interests or our views are going to prevail. What is unusual about Ukraine as a war is it's in the European space. Okay? But, you know, who cares what we think about the war in Sudan or the war in Myanmar or the war that was a big war 2 years ago in Ethiopia with their Eritrea? You know, there are lots of other wars. And actually, this is another point about this, the tyranny of the present. You know, I was talking at the beginning of the tyranny of the present, of believing that what happens now defines subject. So let us just talk about war for just a second. What is modern warfare? Is modern warfare drones in the Ukraine? Is modern warfare sort of ethnic violence in Sudan? Is modern warfare the possibility of a very high-tech Chinese blockade of, or maybe assault on Taiwan? Is modern warfare what's going on in Myanmar at the moment? And the answer is, there is no one state of war. This is the Platonic flaw, or the Neoplatonic flaw of arguing that there is an essentialism. There isn't. You know, okay, people kill each other, but people kill each other for lots of reasons, and it's not necessarily state-to-state warfare. The practicality is war, like government, like religion, is a varied state which operates in different contexts and with different particular circumstances. So incidentally with geopolitics, you know, we were talking about geopolitics earlier. If geography is so dominant, why is North Korea ideologically so different to South Korea? You know, I mean, it's ridiculous to say, you know, you get ludicrous British writers talking about geography as destiny. Well, geography isn't destiny. What geography does do is ensure that some places are closer than others, that some places produce oil and some places produce gas, but geography doesn't determine the human reaction to the circumstances that it is in. It is not geography that is determining what happens in the conflict, for example, that you were talking about earlier between Ukraine and Russia. Sorry, I've been talking too long. Can I just ask one or two of the people who haven't yet said anything? Yes, sir.
It's more maybe methodological and technical, or the more early one theory. I would like to, what do you think about the topic of the archival silencing? Because ideology is one of the main points for understanding policy. I feel like I'm going to be provocative, but in the Middle Ages, crises and political crises and riots are more political than the early modern period. And then in contemporary history, because we have more sources, again, there is more politics in it. So
you're arguing, sorry, this is interesting to me. You're arguing that the archives in early modern Europe do not provide as much of a political.
I'm arguing that maybe I'm referring mainly to the works of De Vivo and Fonghel, and I've written a couple of articles about Venice and the Serenissima, the concept of Serenissimo, where it was argued that it was a more peaceful republic, but then by using other sources to analyze the situation and the actual political concept, these two researchers discovered strongly political tensions. And they argue that.
Yes, I mean, can I just say, I mean, obviously, that's a very good point. Obviously, if you have a governing ideology in which there is a unity, whether that unity is religious or whether that unity is social, whether the unity is political or whether it's a mixture of all of those, then clearly your sources are going to underplay the degree of disaffection there and division. I think you can also see that a bit in modern societies, though. There's a woman called Sarah Davies wrote a very good book on public opinion in Stalin's Soviet Union. And her argument was that actually there was public opinion and that the government had to take note of it, but obviously it was taking place in a context which was not that of adversarial formal politics. Now, you're of the same culture as mine. We have adversarial formal politics where every day the government can expect people to decry it, okay? And some commentators see that as a source of weakness. But you could argue it's the exact opposite, that it provides an opportunity, if government becomes too unpopular, to change the government through some process of either an election or a reconstitution of the ministry. That if, on the other hand, you have an authoritarian or dictatorial society, it is much harder for that society to change direction other than through violence, because the society or the political norms will structure any expression of political views as dissidence, and therefore it is, it is a cause of violence. I mean, look at the classic breakdown of German government in the summer of 1944. By the summer of 1944, Hitler had clearly failed, but there was no reason he'd lost the confidence of quite a few of his generals. There was no way to get rid of him, so they had to try to kill him. That's not a very efficient, that's a very primitive governmental system. Unfortunately, they failed, but it's a very primitive system. And so I would argue that in the early modern period, the most sophisticated societies were those that were willing to accept that there was a division of opinion. That doesn't mean they necessarily were pleased about it. Now, because of the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, unfortunately, it became much more risky in many societies to accept that there were differences of opinion. And from that point of view, I think from the early 16th century till about the end of the 17th century, the expression of opposition viewpoints is often tainted in many societies or discredited by the issue of religious heterodoxy. And I think it then becomes more acceptable in some societies in the 18th century. That's what I would argue, anyway. Somebody else who hasn't said anything. Yes, madam. Oh, yes. Yes.
Something is real. And so the military is not seen as much as the threat for South Koreans as an example so.
Yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The recent attempt by the ruler in South Korea, the president, to, in effect, suspend the constitution, which is what he was really trying to do. His failure was one of the most interesting aspects of recent world history, and it hasn't had much attention elsewhere. I mean, it's quite interesting that, isn't it? Because, South Korea is a significant economic power. It's a very interesting aspect. It shows, as you said, that the crisis seems to have been resolved at the moment with relatively low levels of violence and with relatively low levels of what you might call post-conflict policing. So from that point of view, it's been a major success. Yes, it's been a major success, hasn't it? And it's very interesting. If that process could be followed elsewhere, that would be quite attractive. Yeah. Last question. Anybody not asked one? Oh, yes, sir.
Last few years, especially in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, we saw a part of especially on the newspapers, people saying that the risk of Russification of entire Europe. So not the context of only the Donbass and Crimea, but then development to Russia, Baltic State, and to other European countries of the Western Europe. On the other hand, there are people who are trying to say, no, it's not possible. Russia has never had an interest in the western part, in the western part of Europe, and the connection of Putin to the
Slavophilia, yeah.
My question is, how us, as historian academics who study history about expert, who are expert and trying to become expert, can help people to not be this, how can I say, to not misconcept, but at the same time to not choose a specific party in this debate and to analyze the situation in a more critical way.
Right. The fact that something happened in the past does not necessarily create any norm for the present. So, Russian troops were in Paris in 1815. The Russian troops were in Switzerland in 1799. So what? It was a different world. And I think a lot of the discussion of the past, I mean, the gentleman who made the point about Iraq and Saddam Hussein, often it is very false use of historical examples. Okay, you're not predestined to follow a policy because something happened in the past. Now, as far as the present situation is concerned, the Baltic states, which is what you specifically asked about, are members of NATO. Unless they were going to dismantle NATO, there is obviously a concern there. I don't myself see the Russians as advancing across the border of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I mean, the fact of the matter is the war in Ukraine has been extraordinarily exhausting for Russia. If Russia wanted to lean on other states, it would be easier for it to do so by subversion, by, supporting ethnic Russians who were disaffected in Estonia, for example, or Latvia, where there is a lot of them, or in supporting, shall we say, Serbian revanchism towards Kosovo. But the actual idea of, a sort of a column of Russian tanks moving on Vilnius at the moment, no, I don't see that at all. I think that is a very improbable development. The argument that is being made at the present moment that Western Europe needs, or Europe as a whole, needs to rearm is strategically a bit problematic. Let's put it like that, because the entire strategy is based upon one particular assumption about what an outside power does. Okay? Now, if you were the Italian government, you might argue that your stability would be better obtained by spending money internally for particular purposes, or for addressing issues of instability, shall we say, in Libya, or maybe in the nearby Balkans. You might argue that. I'm not an Italian politician, but what I'm saying is the idea that everything should be spent on high-tech drones is in effect a substitute for strategic thought. So people, instead of thinking about strategy, are thinking about a form of implementation, which is problematic. That would be my approach. Sorry?
A tool debate about tools.
Well, debate about tools, that would be my and I don't think these views of anybody should be necessarily associated with any particular political group. If you are an Italian, whether you are on a supporter of Prime Minister Maloney, whether you are a supporter of the DS or whatever, you ought to be able to have an informed discussion about Italian strategic options without saying such and such an outcome must be what we follow because I'm in that political group. Because the trouble is that puts the political group ahead of the strategic debate. It is obviously an issue for Italy that it has allies, both as a member of NATO, as a member of the European Union, and also because it has bilateral alliance partnerships, as with the United States, or wants them. And because of that, it doesn't have complete freedom of choice, but it does have the freedom to choose within a context of possibilities. And it is pursuing possibilities that I think is important. I'm sorry for talking so long. Now, can I just say, if that was of interest, there is free, you don't need to pay a penny, €1. There is free on my website, me boring on forever about lots and lots of different topics, okay? Including on the history of Italy, actually. But, lots of topics, and you'd be very welcome to read them and use them and whatever, and there's zero charge. Okay.
Thank you.
So, I hope everyone learned many things. Just one last sentence. We talked about modernity and modernization, also the military aspects, and we haven't mentioned the military revolution and Geoffrey Parker during this debate. I think it's an important point. And also there is also material for another discussion.
If you invite me back, I will come again. If you invite me back, I will come again. And I say to the young people here, and I'm afraid you all are young by my standards, get academic jobs and then invite interesting people like me. That would be fun. And I apologise for speaking in English.
Thanks again to Jeremy Black, and see you in the next seminars.
Was that okay?
The toilets. Wow.
It was what you wanted.
Yes. Yeah. Wow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes.